Thank you very much, Arjun. And it's a pleasure for me to be in this platform and host the eminent experts for this session for the next 1.5 hours, which we will be spending together. And I'm sure this will be interesting for all those who have joined as our guests. I welcome everyone. I welcome all the panelists and the guests who have joined from the region as well as maybe from other geographies as well. Each of the panelists have their own rich experience in the subject area within the region as well as outside, and we are looking forward to hear from all of them, their rich experience, their thoughts, and so on and so forth. What I intended to do, just to set a bit of context before I invite them to share their thoughts in a sequence. And as we all know, the climate change, has been one of the topmost area of concern for the humanity, in the recent times. The rapid industrialization that has happened over the past centuries have caused large amount of, what we call anthropogenic emission, that is man-made greenhouse gas emission, which is actually believed to be the key cause of what we call global warming, that allegedly cause extreme climate events, those we see all over the world, heat waves, drought, excessive rainfall, cloudbursts, cyclone, and all these kind of things the world has been witnessing frequently across regions, across geographies. And many of you would also know that the World Economic Forum, WEF, has been publishing a document called Global Risk Report every year. It has been coming out for several years now, which actually draws perceptions of global experts on matters those pose greatest risk for the humankind. And in the last several years, environmental and social risks have consistently been among the top of the list. And in the last 2-3 years, it is the climate risk which has actually been at the absolute top for several 2-3 years now. And among, what if we talk about solutions, there are two-prong approach on, climate action in the worldwide, kind of context. One is what we call mitigation, how to reduce the emission. And that means, taking actions which will cause less and less emission while the economic development and progress keeps on happening for the world. But no matter how much efforts we make, we perhaps cannot just make it zero. There will be some residual emission. And therefore, to tackle that, the second approach, what we talk about is, we call it adaptation. How we adapt ourselves, our ecosystems, our agricultural systems, our way of living better to the increased, climate effects. So today's topic for this webinar, we will be covering more of the mitigation. There have been a global forum, as many of you know, which is called UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, where the world leaders and policymakers have been deliberating on climate action for decades to find a solution. And incidentally, UNFCCC's flagship annual event, which is called the Conference of Parties, the 28th edition, the COP28, is expected to will be held in UAE later this year. And therefore, it is also very significant for this region, for the organizations in the region to understand the significance of mitigation actions, as well as creating their own strategies, action plans, which will be aligned to the global and the regional initiatives that has been taking place over decades. And for any organization involved in any kind of economic or developmental activity, it is important for the organization to understand how much it is contributing to the emission, that is the greenhouse gas emission, which primarily, of course, consists of carbon dioxide, as we know. But there are several other gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and so on, which also contribute, to the global warming. global warming. And each of these has got a scale in which we, for example, we say that methane can be about 21 times or 24 times potent than carbon dioxide in terms of making contribution to greenhouse contribution to global warming. So that scale is defined, and the first step for any organization or any activity is to map what I am emitting. And only then, once I know that what I am emitting, I will be able to take correct and appropriate mitigation actions, particularly how to reduce, what to reduce, and so on and so forth. Typically, just for those who are not so much familiar in this subject area, I would just like to add that these emissions are categorized in what we call scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 being what is happening, emission that is happening directly from a facility because of any kind of fossil fuel being burnt. Scope 2 means the electricity which we purchased, although the electricity is generated somewhere else. So because of our use of that electricity, the emission is happening somewhere else at the power station, of course, if it is not a renewable energy. So that is what we say scope 2 emission of mine. And scope 3 is all other indirect things. For example, we travel for our business, we have our products, we have our supply chain logistics, and so on and so forth. So all these indirect ones are categorized under scope 3. There are much of technical details into that. I'm not going into that. I'm sure some of the panelists will throw some more light into these areas. And there are tools and methodologies how to estimate these different scopes of emission. Globally established tool, there are protocols. One is GHG protocol, for instance, which is widely used. There is one ISO as well for doing that. And based on your organization activities, one applies those tools to kind of estimate the carbon emission. We call it carbon accounting or carbon footprint estimation. These are the kind of terminologies that are used. And once the estimate is established, the next step usually is to decide targets for reduction. Obviously, that depends on what's possible based on the organizational context, the process and technology, the availability of, as well as the cost effectiveness of the alternatives which we have, right? So those are very important, because today, no matter how much we wish, sometimes we are challenged by availability of new technologies, the cost of new technology, and so on and so forth. This will, of course, determine how we reduce the emission within our boundary of our operation. But increasingly, the another thing is happening. The concept is extending, beyond the physical boundary of any organization. The latest thinking, is that the efforts should not only be directed to reduce within my operational boundary, but also how we can help in reducing across the value chain, in our supply and delivery chain, in the life cycle of our products and services, and so on and so forth. So that is something. For example, how we can motivate our suppliers to reduce emissions, so that the embedded carbon footprint in our raw material supplies are eventually kind of reduced. And remember, when I mentioned about scope 3 emission, the value chain usually contributes to most of it for any organization. So a holistic and comprehensive kind of thinking on carbon emission reduction is what is required today, and that is how it is being practiced also by the progressive organizations, progressive individuals, and so on. On one hand, we require global cooperation in exchange of technology, and on the other hand, we also require partnerships at local level, which I'm sure Hanan will be talking about, all these initiatives that has been happening regionally. And that kind of activity will only facilitate an ecosystem that enables actions across industry sectors, companies, region, which will maximize the effectiveness of individual actions that each organization or company kind of takes. And before I conclude my talk, the last item I would touch upon is, about what we call science-based target, SBT. It is a multi-stakeholder initiative that has created a global protocol, for determining and adopting emission reduction targets from an organizational perspective, which actually is aligned to the principle of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial level. There is a science-based theory that suggests that if we are able to do so, means limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, that actually will perhaps be able to avert a climate disaster, for the world. There are evidences, there are scientific, theories which has established this 1.5 degree scenario efficacy, although there are debates still going on whether 1.5 degrees is sufficient or we need to aim even further lower temperature rise. But we will hear about this from our eminent panelists. And with that, I think I shall stop now and invite the panelists for they are sharing their thoughts. Let us, I would request all of the panelists to restrict to maybe about 10-12 minutes so that we have some time afterwards for a Q&A, question and answer session from the audience. So with that, I first turn to Ms. Hanan Bakr. In the context of UAE, especially the COP28 being held in the country later this year, maybe you can elaborate a bit on how you think organizational response from private sector on carbon accounting, climate action are having greater emphasis compared to the past. What are the kind of reactions you are receiving through your interaction with organization and government representatives? Over to you, Hanan.
Thank you so much, Dipankar, and Sabah al Khair, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like that you have set out the scene, Dipankar, in terms of the COP, and I would like as well to stress how COP is very important to us in the UAE, and we were privileged to have two Middle Eastern COPs last year in COP27 Sharm el-Sheikh, this year in the UAE. So this is really a great momentum, particularly for the UAE, Middle East, North African, GCC businesses to be part of this global climate actions. We've been having a lot of interaction from the private sector perspective, and we hear a lot of feedback that sometimes COP is not for me. How can we be on the global climate action? Why this is good for the business? So I believe as well there is a lot of awareness needs to be done, and we cannot rely on government all the time to be providing this awareness. There has to be a type of self-consciousness and responsibility, whether it comes from public organizations, quasi-government, private sector, SMEs, consumer preferences. Everyone is really involved in this value chain. Of course, academia, very important in terms of scientists and the technology and the know-how, which is crucial for this transition. So I want to stress as well that COP is not a commercial exhibition. This is shapes these conferences or these parties. There are 197 countries plus the EU who has signed for the UNFCCC. This is purely climate action policy, involves politicians. In the past, it was restricted to the government's negotiations and agreements. Today, it has been more openly to the private and the business, having the importance of the private sector. Now you see a company like Apple, their GDP net worth is even more than Italy and Canada. Facebook net worth is more than 150 countries. So they are really, really powerful. And the alliances across these countries as well shapes these climate policies. So you see all of the net zero alliances or the fancy one that happens globally, it started with CEOs speaking to each other on common interest in terms of their businesses, and they came out with a set of pledges and commitments. So we urge all the private sector, if you haven't started your transition roadmap, to be starting today. I think Dipankar as well gave you a flavor on what emissions mean. It's not just carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has been the rock star because it's been famous, being mentioned all over the news Methane could be much more dangerous to the environment than carbon dioxide. So you have to look around the greenhouse gas emissions in totality, not just the carbon dioxide. And it's not just emissions. Again, it depends on what area your business is operating in across the whole value chain. Recycling is very important because we don't have a substitution for plastic today, right? So if we don't change the behavior of recycling of plastic and single usage, we don't have an alternative today. You see all of these dumping of plastic and blocking the rivers and going to the marine life. It's not about finding an alternative to plastic. Wood or paper will not be alternative to plastic as of today. They are not as efficient. It's the behavior, how the governments are subsidizing the private sector in order to build up the logistics, find the infrastructure that doesn't eat up their margins in order to do this recycling, create circular economies, how we don't waste more from nature, whether it's not just plastic. I don't want to limit the conversation to plastic, but any material that you're using today, and you have to find yourself within the value chain. So it could be your end product is the scope 1 or 2 for the other business or for the other company, for the consumer as well. So there is a huge education and awareness happening and responsibility across the value chain. I want to stress as well that at COP, we do have our own matrices. We're not accepting companies who hasn't been starting their transition roadmap or have clear science-based targets, giving a piece of paper saying, I have net zero commitment by 2030 to pass through COP, and having it a platform to advertise for your company or branding, that's not allowed. That's not allowed. Greenwashing is not allowed. I'm telling you today that it will come your way very strict transparency and accountability frameworks that will be set on the businesses. I don't want to be threatening, but again, you need as well to understand the risks of not calculating your emissions today. And by the way, this is for the sustainability and continuity of your business. This is for a better access to capital and financing, because it's going to be restricted in the future. If you're relying today on local banks who doesn't adopt these measures and you're only thinking that multinationals are doing it, it will be enforced on everyone, because no one can tolerate any more of the deterioration that's happening with the global climate action. I don't want to take you to sophisticated terms for the people who are not on the global climate action, but this cycle we have the global stocktake. The global stocktake report will come out in June, and it will be capturing the deterioration and what's happening on the miss out of the 1.5 Celsius. And this will come with stricter asks, whether it's an NDC's government level, business accountability, transparency. The tolerance is getting lower and lower for the companies or the governments or any individuals or institution who hasn't started the transition roadmap. If you want a recipe today, where to start and what to do, I think the first point is to start with calculating your emissions today. If you don't know it, you can Google it. There is a lot of campaigns happening, Race to Zero, SBTI, carbon calculators. There is free calculators for SMEs, for large corporates. You have the consultants. So there are no excuses today that you cannot calculate your carbon emission. You need to set a baseline, and you need to set a transition roadmap. When are you going to transition? Which part of your transition, whether it's scope 1 or 2 or 3, what are you doing today? And you need to track progress on annual basis. If you're doing voluntarily this today, it's not going to be voluntary anymore in the future. So you better as well calculate this risk within your business as you calculate the credit risk or the operation risk or the safety risk. Climate is a risk. It's a physical risk. If you don't count for it today, it will come your way anyways. I'll stop here. Thank you, Dipankar, for that. And I'm happy as well. I know that a lot could be having questions around COP itself. Happy as well if you want to reach out or how to be part of COP, or you have any questions or guidance, happy to do this offline as well. Thank you so much. Dipankar, you are muted.
Thank you, Hanan. And I think you brought out very nicely, what COP28 is all about and how organizations should respond. In this context, maybe, it would be good if you touched upon, of course, the physical risks for the organization, but how for the region, the transition risks are also very important. Maybe a couple of words from you on that would be very interesting to hear.
So one of the main scrutinies that everyone is aware about, that UAE is holding up, and UAE is one of the major hydrocarbon experts in the world. Okay, and when it comes to that, I think there is a lot of actions as well that the UAE has been taking in terms of investment in renewables, setting the scene for infrastructure, again on voluntary basis. There hasn't been any mandate on the UAE to be doing that, but this has been even being in action before the Paris Agreement, or before the UAE announcing the net zero by 2050. So this has been happening early on. One of the things that we're advocating, the role of the hard to abate sector and the oil and gas. There are a number of companies that has been advancing others. And I would say, for example, IOCs or multinationals, in terms of the technology that they have, the clean tech technology, and particularly the European countries having the pressure from the EU Commission in doing that. Perhaps some of, or a lot of the companies over here, they are lagging behind, but they have the power again in order to start this transition. Start looking what you can do in terms of energy efficiency today, how you can transition your company by investing more in renewables. Like a lot of the oil and gas companies are rebranding themselves to be energy companies today, not just oil and gas. What does it mean that they are energy? Energy means that they are investing in renewables, they are investing in hydrogen, CCU technology or CCUS technology. So it's not just about cutting the oil and gas today. Like I don't want to go there, but the Ukrainian-Russian conflict has been a great demonstration that we don't have the right demand today for, or the right supply as well, infrastructure in terms of clean energy. When the gas was cut from Europe, a lot of European countries went back to coal, not even back to oil and gas, all right? But that doesn't mean that the oil and gas are the bad boys. They have to be out of the global climate action. They have the power, access to R&D that needs to be directed towards clean energy and climate tech. They need to think with the demand side as well, how you extend this infrastructure to start this transition. Upskilling the employees is very important, because you don't want to be creating a social problem by creating unemployment when you're firing the employees working in the oil and gas. You need to upskill the employee from today for this transition as well, how they can have the expertise on the renewables, whether it's wind farms, solar power plants, whether it's hydrogen, how you can upskill them today. This is a whole ecosystem needs to be created by everyone, and oil and gas and hard to abate sector should be spearheading others. They have access to liquidity, a lot of cash from what they have been collecting all over the years, and their balance sheet is very strong to do this transition. Again, upskilling their employees. They have large number of employees and market share. They can do this transition if they want and they decide to.
Right. Thank you, Hanan, for touching up this very important points. And all over the world, this transition to different forms of energy are going on. Research is going on, and many oil and gas companies are taking significant steps in that. And we know of the story. British Petroleum redesignated themselves as Beyond Petroleum now, right? So these are the exciting examples all over the world. And one very interesting thing is that the chairman designate of the COP28 is actually one of the leaders from, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the Middle East region. So these
It's
are
not just oil
encouraging.
and gas. He's the head
Yeah,
of Masdar as well. So
right,
that sends the message, right? So
right,
he was the head of Masdar. He founded Masdar. And
correct,
then he became the CEO of ADNOC in order as well to start the
right.
transition with ADNOC and oil and gas.
So these are very encouraging signals which the world is receiving. And we also have a few questions in the question box, but what we can do, perhaps we will collect these questions towards the end. I will now turn to Viridiana. Viridiana, would you like to talk a little about, the carbon accounting part, maybe about the scope 3 emission, which many of the members in the audience may not be having very clearer idea. And how do you think the lack of data information can be addressed, and so on, and through your, maybe your experience in the with the organizations in the region and the global context you can bring in.
Okay, good morning all. As you mentioned before, Scope 1 is covers direct emissions from the company. So we already know what kind of emissions we can control, and it's the most easy part of accounting. The Scope 2 covers the indirect emissions from the generation of the electricity, steam, heating, cooling, that we can also report, and it's also we can control because we can know the amount we consume, the amount that we are using. And the challenge is the Scope 3 because includes all the other indirect emissions that occurs in all the company value chain. So why you need a Scope 3 strategy now to focus in this Scope 3? Because if you start to develop a strategy to measure this kind of emissions, you can work closely with the suppliers and customers and reduce it. What some of the challenges that we have in this Scope 3 is like how we gonna collect the data. No, the data is important because if we don't know, if we don't measure, we cannot make efficient reductions in the consumption. So one of the principal data, the challenge that face the organization is how to collect the relevant data, how to analyze the data, and how to provide the solutions with this data we have, because depending of the size of your organization, maybe the data that you have is a small or is a big data, no? And you need help. So there is the good thing that now with the technology and with all this new trend, we can have this help to analyze and have a more easy way to understand where we can have the best effort to reduce our emissions. Also, another challenge that we face in the Scope 3 is that the methodology that we use, because this includes estimating emissions for suppliers that are not calculated for own emissions. So we need to know what methodology are following our suppliers so we can know that is matched with our reporting, no? Even that when we have the proper methodology, there are some uncertainties how they are doing. So we have to do this kind of double check how we are doing with the suppliers, how we are doing our customers, and how we are doing us. And the other is like how different we have in the boundary, because we have to have defining clear value chain boundaries when calculating the Scope 3 emissions, and how we are setting that boundary between our suppliers. Like when, for example, if we are providing outsourcing of transport, how, in which limit we are going to say, okay, this is our part of the emissions, and then from here is your part. So this kind of the things we have to define correctly, and we have to set with them, and we have to define which part is us and which part of the company. And the other is organizational challenge, because we need resources, we need expertise, we have personnel, we have data management, we have quality process that review that everything that we collect, because even the data that we have to know that this data is the correct and it's not a misunderstanding about the data that are providing us. So we have to have this kind of procedures to quality checks that everything that they report is correct. So how can this lack of data information can be addressed? Well, I feel that, as I mentioned before, a business can not manage if we cannot measure. So we need to start with the basic, that is, if organization start to count and measure everything that we have, Scope 1, Scope 2, and then the scope 3. And depending of the size, because it will depend of the size of the company, what kind of software we're gonna need. Because maybe the size of the company is SME, so it's easy to know what kind of the data we have. But the biggest challenge is when we have a lot of suppliers, different companies, different they're coming from different countries, and we have different products, different services. So this kind of the collecting data for each type of service, each type of product that we have through all the value chain is we need someone that review every entry of data and also every exit, no? Scope 3 is like we have a competitive advantage because we can improve our perception by customers and stakeholders, and also the corporate commitment, because we can start to have more commitment to becoming an integral part of corporate strategy to small and large companies to decrease our footprint. And also this kind of change, we have more interest of the investors, because when a company start to do this voluntary carbon emission reporting, the investors start to have this kind of the interest in your company, because you are going ahead with the right way to tackle the climate change. And also another important thing is that you have the cost saving, because when you start to identify what part of the company activities consumes the most energy and resources, you have this possibility of savings, and that is the good part, because it's also profitable. And also you have this green marketing, because with the green marketing you can capture more clients and more customers that interest that you are doing the right way for tackle the climate change. And I think that now we have more interest in the Middle East. We have more interest to commit with the net zero goals, and the good thing that they will have frameworks, and they are developing the government more frameworks to work together with the industry, and also the cultural behavior of the customers are changing, so you have more demand to this kind of companies that are committed with the environment. And in this side of the Middle East, you see more that in Latin America now we have a change of mindset depending of the president that we have. Sometimes if they are more focused in the oil and gas, so in not in tackle the climate change, you have this kind of the difference in between what is happening in Latin America, that this kind of emissions, the companies that are not interested, because it's not aligned with the mindset of the government. But here in the Middle East, you see that most of the companies, they have the frameworks, they have the possibilities, there are a lot of workshops, they have companies, and is, as I mentioned before, the Dr. Hanan, now it's gonna be something that is not be tolerant. You will not have tolerance for the companies that are not interested to report the emissions as scope 3, scope 2, and scope 1. So I think now we need to report with confidence, and the sustainability report is going to have more strength and weight in the reputation of your company. So it's good that you start to doing now the reporting and knowing what you can reduce, you can measure, and then you can have more experience, and with the help of software and with the help of other companies in the areas that you don't know how to reduce your scope 3, you can get the assessment to do it better.
Thank you, Viridiana, for your thoughts. And I think you brought in a couple of important points. See, one is, of course, about tools that can be used for, scope 1, 2, 3 emission, and maybe we will be hearing about one such tool towards the end of the session today itself. And also, you brought about the reliability or the confidence on the data. That is also so important. And that is why, many organizations today, when, they are doing any disclosure related to, be it environmental related disclosure or emission related disclosure, organizations do sometimes seek for external or third party, what we call assurance, and assurance on the data, like just like financial assurance on the non-financial data and information assurance on that. That has been, if we pick up any sustainability report or carbon emission report of organizations, we can always often find that it is assured by a third parties, which of course increases the credibility of the reported data and information, and which helps in eventually setting more accurate targets, setting more accurate pathways for a low carbon transition. Thank you so much. And maybe, Viridiana, I have been hearing in the question box that speakers should, introduce themselves at the beginning, although initially Arjun had given that introduction. Maybe Viridiana, half a minute to tell about what you do. What is your kind of work?
Well, I'm sustainability consultant. I work in Ras Al Khaimah municipality in the energy department. So we developed programs to reduce the energy consumption in the industry and also in the residents. And I have my previous experiences in oil and gas in the energy sector. So we are interested to the decarbonization. So we try to find new sources for renewable energy and to escalate with the SME competitions that we have in Ras Al Khaimah now, that if you are involved in energy sector, energy management, and the off the grid, you could have this, you can apply for this competition and have this price, that we have a monetary price. So if you have a solution of these problems that we have, you can apply, and then you are the winner. You can be in Ras Al Khaimah and then escalate your solution.
Thanks, Viridiana. I can see some questions are accumulating in the chat box, which we will take later. But now it is time to turn to Tamara with us. And Tamara, hi. Welcome you on this session, and maybe you can just half a minute introduction of yours, and then you'd like to share your thoughts on maybe the global trends and practices, why reduction is so important, what are the risks, opportunities in this particular context, and maybe you could tell the topic I initially started touching upon a little bit on the SBTI. Maybe members in the audience would be interested to know a little more about that. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. So good morning. My name is Tamara Withers. As mentioned earlier, I have been in the UAE 14 years, 10 of which I spent at Emirates Nature WWF as a corporate sustainability expert. So I'm bringing to you today a unique perspective, because one thing we've heard a lot about today is the role of government, the role of private sector. And the role WWF has played, as several other organizations have, is the role of civil society, kind of bringing it all together. And that was our specialty at WWF, was bringing the government stakeholder, the private sector stakeholders together to identify, why aren't businesses reducing carbon? What are the challenges? And how can we address those with government to provide solutions? And again, it's not just government that's going to reduce, not just private sector. It is really a collaboration that is going to be needed. And this is still, for me, an area to see that needs a lot of growth here in the UAE, is that voice of civil society to kind of bring together and find these areas of collaboration and propel them forward. And the other thing that at WWF we brought to the UAE is the global resources, and I'm going to talk about one of those resources called the SBTI a little bit later today. So I hope that gives you some background of my perspective. Before that, I worked for the US government. I've done volunteering. I have a degree, I have an MBA and a degree in conservation biology. So it's many years of experience that I bring to the UAE and to this topic here, which is one thing actually I enjoy about the UAE is this coagulation of all these ideas, global ideas, and then finding the best solution for what works for the UAE and the GCC as a whole. I'm going to echo quite a few things that Dipankar and Hanan and Viridiana have already said and bring it together in a slightly different way. Bakr provided a good introduction as to why this is important. Why is tackling our carbon emissions or our greenhouse gas emissions? And I saw in the comments, you know, and with several speakers I'd mentioned, it's not just carbon. And we could have maybe a smaller level of emissions towards methane, but methane is actually going to impact climate change much more than perhaps the same unit of carbon that is being emitted. So what we're looking to do globally is limit global warming to 2 degrees, but really aspire to limit to 1.5 degrees, which is really what we need in order to avoid the worst of climate change. And what does this mean in terms of cutting emissions? Basically, by 2030, which feels just around the corner, is by cutting emissions by half, almost half. And when we talk about net zero, we need to achieve net zero by 2050. And based on science, this is what we currently believe is what's going to be needed. Again, science evolves and it's going to need constant analysis. And I believe it was Dipankar who said, perhaps we're going to even need more than that. But based on today's science, this is what we're looking to achieve. So the private sector, as mentioned by Hanan and Dipankar, is really coming under pressure. In having 10 years of experience here in the UAE, it has been amazing to see the evolution of what private sector has been doing in terms of addressing carbon. It is in continuing to accelerate its efforts, and we still have a long way to go, but there's a lot of positive to focus on here. This pressure we can see, particularly as Hanan mentioned, it's no longer going to be voluntary. We are moving towards mandatory. And I think we can just look at the UAE government's requirement of registered or listed companies on the Abu Dhabi and Dubai stock markets. They're now required to report. And this is just an indication. This is just the first step of where things are going here in the UAE. And the sooner we begin, the better things will get and the easier it will be for organizations. And I completely echo what the other speakers have said about the availability of resources now that were not available many years ago. And when I'm talking about resources, I mean local resources, working with organizations that understand our unique situation here in the UAE and how we might attempt to tackle it. It's not going to be the same as America or Europe or other parts of Asia. And I think that's really important, is that we have locally based examples and solutions. It's important, and we're all said the exact same thing, so I'm happy to hear that. What you can't manage what you don't measure, right? I'll come back to that. And really, when you start to look at your emissions, you're going to start to identify what some of these climate risks are to your business. Physical, let's think. All of our infrastructure is hugging along that coast of the UAE, for example. What happens if and when, more importantly, the storms get stronger? What exposure are we going to have? We already know what happens when it rains. An extra long time. We know what happens. So what are our physical risks to our business? Also, our reputational risks, and I believe it was Hanan who mentioned this. There are reputational risks by not taking action. More and more of the stakeholders, not just government, are demanding that organizations take action. Customers, employees are asking in interviews now or researching beforehand, what is this company doing about the issues I care about? In many parts of the world, there's also litigation risk. And many examples in India, in the United States, there's litigation risk for not taking action. The good side, though, is that you can only identify your risks and be able to manage those risks better, but you also have opportunities, resource efficiency. Again, mentioned earlier, the opportunity for savings, missed savings that could be reinvested in other parts of the business to grow the business, there's an incredible opportunity there, as well as identifying new products that your companies can offer others to reduce their emissions, or alternatively to the end user to improve their energy efficiency management at home or elsewhere. So moving on to the global trends and practices. So I identified 4 global trends and practices, and this comes a little to what Viridiana was saying about the global ESG measurements and reporting frameworks. And there's been a lot of talk, and continues to be, about the standardization. So if you look at studies now when businesses are being interviewed, some of them are doing GRI, some of them are doing ISO, some of them are doing some of them are even cherry picking from each of these different guidelines and frameworks and coming up with their own reports based on that. But this is difficult for businesses to do in the sense of that they're not sure which is the best framework, guideline, or standard to achieve and what is most material to their business. So it creates a barrier for them to even sometimes enter ESG. But at the same time, on the flip side, and we're talking about investors today as well, investors need a way to compare businesses because they're choosing where their money goes. And right now, with the different types of ESG standardized reporting there is, it's almost impossible to compare businesses and benchmark them to understand where they stand in terms of how they're reducing their carbon and what those risks and opportunities for those businesses are. Again, big topic today is the growing focus on scope 3. So the second trend in practice is the growing focus on scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And this is, again, depending where you are on your sustainability journey, okay? If you're a small SME, you might not jump immediately to scope 3. It's fine to start with scope 1 and scope 2. I always worry about organizations at the beginning of their journey feeling intimidated, feeling then they need to jump immediately to net zero. This is a process, and it's not always right to jump to net zero or do scope 3 at the beginning of your journey. You will get there, but it can take time. But still, for those organizations that are in certain industries, in a certain size, multinationals, we're further along in their journey. Scope 3 is becoming increasingly important and an absolute must. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. We also see the rise in, and this term's thrown out a lot, a rise of net zero commitments. And this is as a result of businesses actually seeing now the evidence of what climate change is going to mean for them. And again, like we said earlier, it's the push for the decarbonization that's intensifying by all stakeholders, not just governments. The fourth global trend and practice, and this is the one I feel particularly strongly about, is the increased engagement with stakeholders. And you'll see COP28's got it. That they're really working hard to engage the communities and businesses and bring them in part, make sure they're part of these discussions that have that are important, that they're involved in, along with the governments and civil society. But for businesses, and we talked about the value chain, I'll mention it again a little bit later in terms of scope 3, really working with your stakeholders. And it's important, I'll expand on that, but this is still something I find, particularly in this region, there's a little bit of hesitation around doing is going beyond the company. So I'll come back to that a little bit more in depth in a few minutes. I wanted to highlight the 5 steps that I see as part of the carbon reduction process. And I'm going to get into SBTI here. And I'm not going to repeat too much in depth about what the 3 previous speakers have said, but basically you always have to start with measuring what your emissions are. You can't reduce without that. You need to know where your emissions are coming from. Like Viridiana said, like identify what scopes you're doing. An absolute must is scope 1 and scope 2. And depending where you are in terms of industry, the size and your journey, incorporating scope 3. It's often surprising to organizations that a majority of their emissions are scope 3. And yes, they're the more difficult ones to tackle because of the number of stakeholders up and downstream that they're going to have to involve. And again, coming back to the ESG standardization, how one organization, company's measuring it might not be the others. So it's a matter of regulating all of that. Ultimately, it's very important to remember at the bottom of this, again, something that has been brought up today that I absolutely echo is the reliability of your measurements, the accuracy, and the transparency. And I'll definitely mention that again, because it's so key to ensuring, at least mitigating your reputational risk and actually ensuring you're having impact with what you're doing. So the first step is understanding your emissions. The second is target setting. So now that you know where your emissions are coming from, you're ready for this step. And one of the ways, you can do this many ways, but the one and the bias I have is the science-based target initiative, because it's backed by WWF, CDP, the UN Global Compact, and the World Resources Institute, 4 powerhouses in climate change and addressing climate change. And what they're trying to do is drive impact. They want to show organizations exactly how much needs to be reduced in terms of greenhouse gases to avoid the worst of climate change. Okay, it's science-based if it's in line with the scale of reduction required to keep global warming below 2 degrees. And they break it down into 2 sets of targets: the near term, which I talked about earlier, which is basically 2030 or the next 5 to 10 years. And this is key. It's not just about your 2050 long-term net zero. The second part is that the long-term net zero 2050. And they're working with organizations all sizes. They at the SMEs have a slightly different streamlined approach just because of their size. It's of less than 500 employees, you'll qualify for the SME approach. But then those businesses that are larger than that are required under SBTI to do 5 things. One of them is a commitment letter signed by the company to setting and achieving the targets. Then it's setting the target. And now the companies, they themselves determine that, then they submit it to the review committee at the SBTI to be verified. That it truly is in line with the reduction that is needed. So this is how they verify it's science-based. They are then required to communicate this. And this comes back to what I was saying about transparency earlier. They're required to communicate this to their stakeholders. So there needs to be a public commitment about this. But beyond that, there needs to be, and I think we've all talked about this, is the disclosure piece. And disclosure is incredibly important. This is something that is interesting. There's a recent report by APCO about ESG in the GCC. And one of the things they found, sure, there's quite a few companies who are doing ESG reporting, great. But what they're not doing is disclosing. And this lacks transparency. And transparency is something that is very important to make sure that we're moving towards achieving what needs to be done to limit global warming to 2 degrees. So just to recap, understand your emissions. You have to target set. And the last little bit is going to overlap with my last 3 steps in terms of your carbon reduction process. You have to have an implementation plan. And this is where stakeholder management comes in really importantly. It's not just your external stakeholders. You need to back up, and there's 2 sets of internal stakeholders that must be on board. Oftentimes in the companies I work with, usually SMEs or organizations that are on the beginning of their journey, you don't have a chief sustainability officer. This sits in marketing or communications or EHS, and oftentimes not in senior leadership. It's very important that senior leadership have buy-in to that target that is set and the implementation plan to achieve that target. Aside from them, it needs to be pushed out throughout the organization. This is never the responsibility of one group. It is an organizational commitment. And the employee engagement plan is equally as important as shutting off the lights. The the employees across all aspects have an opportunity to contribute and are going to be responsible, most likely, for helping reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. So that's absolutely imperative. At the same time, looking externally, and depending on the type of organization or business that you have and the products and services, is engaging your employees. Or sorry, engaging your customers is what I meant to say, and your supply chain. And this will come back to a little bit more getting into scope 3, but also even addressing scope 1 and 2, it's important that they're engaged and they have communication about what the company is committed to. And the fifth step, which I've already spoken about in terms of SBTI, which also echoes this, is the disclosure piece. It's measuring annually with externally assured organization reviewing your reports. And this is, again, like I said, when we look at ESG in the GCC, this is where a lot of improvement there's a lot of area for improvement in terms of just disclosing. And this has been very frustrating when I first came to the region, and still now, is this transparency piece. We have a lot to learn from each other, and we can't do that unless we're willing to share. And I'd love to flip the impression that disclosure is something negative. And this isn't just for ESG, but I think transparency needs to be encouraged. And I'm glad to see the UAE government taking steps towards that. But this is an area that I see a lot of potential growth in. And then that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Tamara, for an excellent sharing of your thoughts. And I think you very rightly pointed out about the risks, but also the cost of inaction, which is so important, and the opportunities which the actions can bring in for the organizations, for the company, and also for the humanity. So that's important. And also I think it is important also to understand that today, if I may just add to what you said, Tamara, that today it is also very important to understand the financial implication of climate change and its effects. And that's why today there is another standard for the benefit of the audience. I would just mention about this TCFD, Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, which companies are being encouraged to follow this standard to disclose, and specifically the stakeholders, investors are looking at TCFD related disclosures from the companies. And it essentially talks about, it asks you what is your governance process for managing climate change, what is the strategy, what is the risk management matrices, and also the overall matrices and targets for your organization, which organizations may follow SBTI, organizations may follow some other principles, but disclosure, transparent disclosure around that, how you are perceiving the risk, what are the opportunities you are seeing. So this is something all investors are, when they are putting money into any organizations, they are asking these questions, and therefore the significance of this TCFD based reporting has been very, very prominent in the last couple of years. Today, a lot of companies do use this framework to disclose, and I think this will go on increasing over the years. Right. Thanks. With this, maybe I will turn to our next panelist, Karim. Karim, you come from real estate sector, so maybe you can throw some lights. And real estate sector has always been, particularly in this region, UAE and the Middle East region, has been looked upon as one of the major contributors to emission, unless of course some of the companies are really turning to renewable energy. But in general, this is a sector that contributes significantly. So how this sector responding to climate action, we would very much like to hear your thoughts and your experience, and how it can be a part of the solution. To be very frank, that is important to hear. And maybe Karim, you can start with a half-a-minute introduction of yourself and then proceed on to the topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipankar, for this introduction, and thanks for all of our speakers as well. So my name is Karim Elnabawy. I'm a senior sustainability manager in ROSHN Real Estate, and I'm leading the sustainable development for buildings within the sustainability department of ROSHN. So during my career, I was focused more on the design and construction of assets and master plans. And actually, what caught my attention in this discussion is that we're tackling the same subject, but from different perspectives. And that's very important for all of us to hear the different opinions and different views. Um, because for us, I look at it from a project perspective more than the corporate perspective, because it's actually linked together. So whatever targets are being set by a corporate, it should be actioned also by all of its assets. And as you mentioned, Dipankar, that the real estate sector is contributing tremendously towards the increase of greenhouse gas emissions. And when you look further into this, you can see that scope 3 is the major contributor. When you dig further and check what's actually driving this, you can see that the big elephant in the room is the concrete and steel, which actually is a big issue and a big problem for us, because everywhere when you look around, you will see concrete everywhere. And solutions needs to take place to be able to tackle this issue. But before speaking about solutions, also Viridiana talked about the challenges that they're facing, because these are the similar challenges that we're facing in terms of calculating and measuring our carbon emissions. So when we talk about the challenges, it's obvious that there is a lack of data, and not only lack of data, but also the accuracy of data being provided to us by the manufacturers, and the supply chain is not allowing us to appropriately measure our carbon emissions. Specifically related to the materials that are major contributors, which is the structural main system of the materials of the buildings, like the concrete and structural steel as well. There should be some ways to replace these, and that's actually something that the real estate industry is trying to drive, and they cannot drive.
Karim, I think you went on silent mode.
Sorry, so I was unmuted. No. So I was talking about the supply chain and how they are actually need to provide more accurate data to be able to measure appropriately the emissions for all of our assets. And this is something that will contribute towards the embodied carbon and how we can tackle this. And from a design and construction perspective, since I'm already involved in this, we should be able to drive this from design perspective when we are selecting the proper design, minimizing the materials that we are designing, replacing the materials, and making sure that we're not specifying materials that are either not available or consuming a lot of materials or requires a lot of transportation. Because when we look at this, we look at this from a life cycle perspective, a holistic approach from the extraction of the material, the location of the material, where it comes from, transportation for this material towards the manufacturing site, and then what happens in the manufacturing site. Are they using a renewable energy? Are they just relying on the conventional grid energy where it's just fossil fuel again? And what's actually happening after this? Are they sending this to another manufacturer, or they're just sending this directly to our project site? And again, it goes to the site, and then this from A1 to A5 is the major greenhouse gas emissions emitted. And this is the problem that we're facing and the main challenge. So it's important to think about it this way from buildings perspective. And then this should be aligned to what the corporate or what the organization is trying to achieve. For sure, Tamara already explained about the benchmarking and the mapping and setting the targets for the carbon and all these stuff. And then for us, we should be able to take action. We should action this on a project level. That's related to the carbon, but also there are so many other things that's also impacting the real estate sector. And one of the trends that I want also to mention is the electrification, because also we should be able to drive the change in the market towards the use of or the reliance on of EV chargers, for example, or electrical vehicles, and try to avoid any reliance on the transportation methods that still use the normal fossil fuels and etc. Also, there is also the climate resilience, which is also impacting businesses and impacting the credibility of each organization. And again, I'm looking at this from a project perspective, where we have to investigate further how we can quantify and measure the impacts. And we have so many hazards that we need to be able to identify, we need to be able to also measure, and we have to provide the risks associated with this, what are the mitigations, what are the possible solutions that we can integrate into our buildings and projects and master plans to be able to tackle these issues. Another aspect is the biodiversity, because any development that we are we're trying to actually develop, it's against nature, it's against the environment, unless it's a sustainable development where we're trying to enhance the biodiversity and the ecosystem of each site that we are developing. And that's for sure contributing again to the CO2 emissions that we're trying to tackle here. Talking about some of the solutions that we might have as well when we talk about the normal construction methods, where we're trying to shift away from reliance on concrete, and we're trying to find modern MMCs or modern methods of construction, where we're trying to reduce in the real estate sector the amount of concrete used. We're trying also to avoid using structural steel if we can, that there should be some also other alternatives that are being part of the innovation practices in the market, and there is a lot of research about it. So that's just an overall view on the subject. And back to you, Dipankar.
Thank you. Thank you, Karim, for this sector has been in the spotlight, and you touched upon quite a few interesting things. And of course, not only for this sector, but for many other sectors, as I said initially as well, the scope 3 is actually very, very significant. Many operations themselves may not be so carbon intensive, but what is coming in the supply chain sometimes becomes so important. And that is why today there is a great focus, emphasized focus on, scope 3 emission. So I think, Gokul, should we go for...
before we jump in and have Martin to do his presentation, might we will just answer a couple of questions, and then we can take the rest of the questions after his presentation.
I think that is good. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the questions is for Hanan. Hanan, one of the people delegates have asked, how do you actually get the private sector engaged in Dubai? He went to say that Kuwait is a no-go there, as there is little enforcement. And also they've asked, what are some specific opportunities for SMEs to be involved in COP in supporting UAE's efforts?
Sure. Sure. So the first question around the interaction of COP, first of all, that we need to realize that this is a UNFCCC type of engagement, and hence, if you don't have a transition roadmap, you're not reached a zero member, or have equitable action. Equitable action means you don't have science-based targets, or you haven't started your transition already, you don't have a place in COP. So again, this is not commercial branding or marketing type of event. So this is first the matrix to be joining COP, and this is all across, whether you want to have a booth in COP or you have even a slot to speak in an event. You're not going to have it if you don't have a transition roadmap, a genuine one. We don't want, again, someone like started the transition roadmap 1 month before COP and provide us a paper or promise us. We have our own matrices, we do our own due diligence in order to ensure that we don't support greenwashers. So this is number one. Number two, how to engage with us. There are two ways. There are people who are just interested at an event at COP itself. So we have our own sponsorship and events team that we can refer them, refer these companies to them, and they have their own sponsorship packages this is out of my scope. There is a whole sponsorship and events team who have this facility, or even people who wants to do catering, have airlines, promotional fairs, they can do that. Of course, if you haven't attended COP before, there are two zones, the blue zone, the green zone. The blue zone is where the agreements happens between intergovernments. There might be access to some private sector parties. I cannot comment on that now, since this is something we're agreeing on with the UNFCCC, but perhaps there will be some participation from the private sector in the blue zone. The green zone is under the control or management of the UAE government. So this, again, you have to be passing this criteria that I have mentioned in order to have a space in the green zone to show best practices, to launch forums or series, to have a sustainability fashion show, whatever it is you come ahead with in terms of ideas. And it depends on the layout and the plan. And we're already having conversations with a lot of private sector companies that they have reached out to us, whether globally or locally or regional, around that. So this is one. There is another way to engage with us, and this is my scope, on the thought leadership, meaning that how we can derive the climate policies, or if you are already a company that has a lot of initiatives or know-how, or you're a civil society or others. I don't want to limit this into the energy sector, but to widen it as well. And you want to be, for example, joining one of the alliances that are the presidency running, or you want to explore how you're a global company, you want to explore how to join alliances in the UAE, or what to be done, we're happy to help with that as well. The SMEs, we're going to have a huge program for them, but I cannot talk about it now since it's confidential, but you will be impressed with the program that we are going to be rolling out, hopefully by summer, for SMEs. And it's going to be free of charge to help the SMEs to start the transition roadmap, a serious one, a way for them to track their progress, to be members of the One of Prominent campaigns globally. It will be in Arabic for the non-English speakers as well. So the MENA region will not going to have any excuses if they are not English speakers, or access to campaigns, or have guidance, or they don't have the financial capability to be part of it. So that's going to be available by summer, but again, I cannot provide details on this call. There will be a tech and innovation competition as well, because tech and innovation is a huge focus for us. We believe that this is crucial for the transition. We cannot move on without tech and innovation. There will be a number of big presentations for tech and innovation at this COP, and we're relying on the civil society, on even financial and investment parties for putting fund, or again, this is not a funding type of call. We don't provide funds, but others might put together a fund, and that would be available as well for tech and innovation. There could be a competition for tech as well that the presidency office itself will be rolling out, so that when it comes to SMEs and startups, how to be engaged at COP. Again, there are some SMEs around the world who knows their ways to COP, because they have been advancing their global climate action, so they know how to be part of the green zone, what to be done. But we're happy as well to assist over here if someone wants to speak to our events and sponsorship team. If this is not available on the website, we're happy as well to help and refer them to them.